Okay, so we're going to get started today. Um, we would like to welcome you and greet you to the Campus Stress Reduction Project. Today's webinar will cover cultural components of stress and stress reduction. My name is Nadalyn Reyes and I am an MSW intern at Fresno City College.
Hello, my name is Enrique Mercado, and I'm also an MSW intern at Fresno City College.
And we would like to thank you all for joining us today.
So first, we would like to take some time before we go on with the presentation with the poll. And the statement reads, I am able to clarify, or I'm able to clearly define my cultural identity. Now, the purpose of this is to see if you have a clear understanding of what culture is, as well as trying to identify your cultural identity. So I'm gonna go ahead and provide you some time to think about the statement above and respond. All right, so the results are in. It says here that people agree that they can clearly define their cultural identity, and that is great. I hope by the end of this presentation, you can add some additional tips and some additional information that maybe you didn't know before. And for those of you that neither agree nor disagree, I hope you can also find some additional tips or some strategies to help cope with the stress that deals with cultural identity. Next slide, please. So in this slide, we're talking about culture. What is culture? It is a system, a dynamic whole that creates and is created by people, places, and practices. It's a system that can be defined by its components that are inseparable and engage in mutual determination. The whole organizes the parts, and the parts organize the whole. People create culture through shared practices and places, and culture shapes how people engage in practices and how they build places. Culture can also be defined as a complex whole, which includes knowledge, belief, art, morals, customs, and any other capabilities and habits acquired by a person as a member, as a member of society. Understanding how culture functions as a system requires discussing its components. People are the first essential component of culture as a system. There is no culture without people, as well as there is no people without culture. People refer to population dynamics, social relations, and culture in groups, and that include families, communities, and nations. But what is a system? Well, a system can be defined as a group of interacting or interrelated elements that act accordingly to a set of rules to form a unified whole. It is a system surrounded and influenced by its environment and is described by its boundaries, structure, and purpose, as well as expressed in its functioning. This is also known as systems theory. Next slide, please. On this slide, I'm going over examples of cultural components. And the first thing I'd like to discuss is age and generation and how people of different ages are affected. The younger generation who immigrated or who immigrates find it easier to assimilate because they have yet to form their identity. Opposed to the older generation who immigrated, is a little more harder for them to assimilate because they've already found their identity as to what to believe in and how to act. And this can cause stress because For those of the younger generation assimilating to a new culture, you're getting taught one thing, but then coming home and then getting taught another thing. And this can be stressful for the older generation as well, because they're trying to preserve their own culture and their own beliefs. Next, I want to talk about gender and identity. In culture, gender plays a huge role. Some cultures believe that the head of the family is the father, and he gets to have the say so as to what is acceptable and what is not. This can create stress for both the younger child who is assimilating to a different culture, as well as the father trying to preserve their cultural beliefs. Now I want to talk about sexual orientation. In some cultures, they believe that there are only two different sexes, male and female. Being gay, lesbian, or transgender is unacceptable in some of these cultures. This makes it difficult for an individual to find their own identity apart from these human ideas. Ethnic identity. This can become challenging to identify who you are, especially when you assimilate to a dominant culture. A good example of this for me is when I go visit my grandparents in Mexico, I often get criticized for not being Mexican enough. And then when I come back into the States, I often get criticized for not being American enough. So the struggle to find balance between those two components can be stressful. The next, I want to talk about faith beliefs. And this has a significant impact on culture and how culture perceives the primary source of their beliefs. An example of this is gay marriage, or the roles of the family of who has to say so to what, as well as what is appropriate to wear. It even tells us what our morals are. And a good example of this is the Ten Commandments. Now I want to talk about social economic status. Some cultures believe that social economic status is the most important thing to acquire, while other cultures preserve more of a balance to incorporate family and not make life all about work. Although socioeconomic wealth may bring you materialistic things, it cannot buy you back the time you missed out on your family or the things you wish you could have redone in your life. Next, I'm gonna talk about geographic location in regards to where you were raised as to where you're living now. Transitioning from a culture of where you used to live to a new culture where you live now can feel foreign and overwhelming. It can also be stressful trying to make the transition, whether this is in a work setting, school setting, or experiencing both of them at the same time. Geographic location influences how one speaks and what one chooses to talk about. This illustrates what is important to them and their culture. Now I'm gonna talk about occupational profession. In many cultures, our professions are chosen at birth. If my dad and his father before him was a doctor or lawyer, then now I was expected to follow in that tradition. This hinders the younger generation's ability to choose their own profession and what is best for them. And this can even be stressful because coming to a different culture from your own, where it's teaching you to be assertive, to be passionate, can mean being disrespectful and not honoring your family in another culture. Now I want to talk about level of education. Cultures all have different perspectives on education. Many cultures highly devote all their time to the child's success in their academics. An example of this is the tiger mother approach. This is described as a form of strict parenting and where parents are highly invested in ensuring their children's success. This stereotype was drawn from Asian mothers, and is a stereotype that still exists today. Next slide, please. Next, I want to talk about the products of cultural identity. As you can see here is an illustration of a flower, and in the center you have culture. Now the things that are surrounding the center of the flower are its petals. And each one of these petals represents the product that altogether create cultural identity. There's one thing I do want to provide an example of. For example, the art and drama and music, the drums. We may see them as a form of entertainment, while in other countries, they're used especially for ceremonies, rituals, or religious purposes. Even the construction of the drum differ throughout cultures. Some are made out of metals, or some of other natural resources. And even the characteristics of how they look and how they sound differ across cultures. Again, I want to illustrate the most important aspect of this slide is that all of these petals create cultural identity. And if one of these petals are missing, well, then we don't have cultural identity. Next slide, please. Next, I'm going to talk about race, ethnicity, and culture. Race can be described as the concept of dividing people into groups on the basis of various sets of physical characteristics and the process of ascribing social meaning to those groups. Ethnicity can be describes the culture of people in a geographic region, including their language, heritage, religion, and customs. Now, a key thing to remember is that both race and ethnicity are components that make up culture. Race and ethnicity alone together do not mean or equal culture. These are all human ideas. Next slide, please. Religion. Religion can be defined as a cultural system of symbols that informs action, social order, and worldviews. And again, religion alone does not make up culture. Religion also has influences on practices, rituals, moral values, and clothing. And we see examples of this in some cultures. They practice fasting for their practices, or they have their moral values derived from more of their faith, 10 Commandments, or the clothing of telling you what is appropriate to wear and what is not appropriate. Next slide, please. Next, I'm going to talk about cultural foods, also known as traditional dishes. These represent the beliefs and practices of a geographic region, ethnic group, and religious body, or cross-culture community. Food is a shared commonality among cultures. And although the food may be different, it serves one key purpose, and that's to bring people together. And we see examples of this for Thanksgiving, Christmas, and other holidays. There's even certain foods that we see as the same, but are actually differ in the characteristics throughout culture. One example of this is bread. Challah has the characteristics of a braided bread, a little bit more different than the original bread that you would make your bologna sandwiches with. You also have cornbread. You also have pita bread, which is kind of like a tortilla, a little more thicker, round and soft. And then you have naan bread, which is a fried bread, or can be oven baked, that also is a flat breaded food. Next slide, please. Cultural behavioral practices. Now, this can be defined as a recurrent way of acting by an individual or group toward a given object or a given situation. Behavioral patterns have some continuality across generations among specific groups and populations. They vary across different people, but remaining somewhat consistent within each one. The first I'd like to go over is therapy and counseling. In some cultures, they frown upon this. If I were to go tell my mom that I was taking or I was seeing a therapist, she would say, "Está loca," meaning that I'm crazy. And that was her mindset on that. And even for me, perceiving that can be stressful and make me want to turn away that help and maybe even increase my stress or anxiety or whatever I'm dealing with. Second, I like to talk about medical, Western versus traditional holistic practices. So Western practices is what we're known to do today. We call a physician, we rely on their expertise to diagnose what's wrong with us, and they provide a treatment. Now, traditional holistic practices have pretty much the same concept. You go see a person with their expertise, and then they try to treat you with natural resources. The only difference is that Western medicine issues things like chemicals and other substances, whereas the traditional holistic practices again focus on natural resources from the earth. Next, I want to talk about finances. Now, finances, there's different roles between cultures. For example, going back to the father who has all the authority figure will also have the obligation of the finances. On other cultures, you have women who say what is going to be sent, what's going to be spent, what is going to be saved. Now, finances also creates a stress on the younger generation because in some cultures, what they believe is that if you're living in a house, you must contribute. So that means your check and what you're working for gets distributed amongst among the house members of the house, or it goes to that father figure who is controlling the financial or the finances of the house. And this can be stressful because for the younger generation who's assimilating to this new culture, they see it as dishonest, unfair. And on the other end of the stick, the father sees it as being unhonorable, disrespectful. So situations like this can cause even more stress between the older generation and younger generation. I also want to talk about parenting and child nurturing. So across from all cultures, again, we have a wide variety of ideas of how we should parent and how we should treat our children. And some of these disciplines are more harsh and others are more lenient. But what's important is to realize this and not to judge it and to learn and grow. Next slide, please. On this slide, we're talking about expression of culture. So I believe everyone should have the privilege to express themselves. And a good example of this is, I remember as an undergraduate, I was working at Carl's Jr., and there was this Islamic who practiced their spiritual faith. And people would criticize him for his practices and called it ridiculous. What I remember saying to myself was how important it is to be mindful. And what I mean by this is to allow yourself to properly validate someone else's practice. And it also goes back to that golden #1 rule that you learned in elementary. Treat others the way you would want to be treated. Also, we also need to remember when communicating with other people to keep an open mind about our tone. Sometimes we can talk loud and other people can perceive that as insulting, threatening, and even come off as aggressive. And another key thing to remember is expressing oneself passionately based on who they are is going to be perceived differently. And what I mean by this is that someone could say something, and because of who you are or who you culturally identify as, they might perceive you as being overly aggressive. And on the other hand, another person of a different culture might say the exact same thing in the exact same tone of voice and be perceived as passionate. Next slide, please.
Okay, so before I begin my section, I would like to conduct another poll for you. And so the poll states, I have experienced discrimination and or bias as a result of my cultural identity. And I'll give you some time to answer this poll. Okay, so it looks like most of us have said agree and strongly agree, and I can only imagine the stress that that has brought on. So in my section, I'll be talking about how cultural components relate to stress and go over stress reduction as well. So before I go into my section, I want to go over these terms, which are multicultural, cross-cultural, and intercultural. So multicultural refers to a society that contains several cultural or ethnic groups. People live alongside one another, but each cultural group does not necessarily have engaging interactions with each other. And cross-cultural is the comparison of different cultures. So in this type of society, differences are understood and acknowledged and can bring about individual change, however, not collective transformations. So in these types of societies, one culture is often considered the norm, and all other cultures are compared or contrasted to the dominant culture. And lastly is intercultural. So these are communities in which there is a deep understanding and respect for all cultures. Intercultural communication focuses on the mutual exchange of ideas and cultural norms and the development of deep relationships. And in this type of society, no one is left unchanged because everyone learns from one another and grows together. And so when we look at a cross-cultural society, American society often leans towards a white Christian dominant society. With that, it's important to reflect on how this could increase stress levels on minority groups. And again, as we go through our presentation, I just want you to reflect on which type of society you're familiar with or you have experienced, and which society is kind of the goal of what we hope to reach. So there are three types of stress, as we may know, which are acute, chronic, and traumatic. Acute stress is short-term and the most common form of stress, while chronic is long-term. And traumatic stress can be short or long-term, and it can occur after one event or many. And when it comes to stress, an individual's culture could affect their experience in a number of ways, including the type of stressor to which they are likely to be exposed to, the way these stressors are perceived and understood, and the extent of the physiological stress response produced, and then the coping mechanisms available to deal with the stressor. And so different cultural groups inhabit different areas such as geographical, economic, and political. And for this reason, they are likely to be exposed to different types of stressful events. And different sources of stress are experienced by members of a minority culture living within a majority culture. So that would be in reference to a cross-cultural type of society. And so some causes for stress within different cultures are environmental and neighborhood stress, perceived discrimination, microaggressions and racism. I know Enrique mentioned in his section obeying the head figure in the family and how that can bring stress to a family unit or to a community. And then there are consequences for not obeying, and family members may leave the family unit because of not being able to follow the head figure in the family, and how family members leaving can bring additional stress. Additionally, language barriers can cause some stress, acculturative stress, high expectations for their children's academic success, multicultural and cross-cultural societies, deportation and immigration related stress, and race related stress. So I'd like to go over acculturative stress and acculturation. So acculturation can be defined as the acquisition and adaptation to the cultural values, the attitudes, and practices of the majority culture. And so acculturative stress refers to the stressors associated with being an immigrant or ethnic minority and going through the acculturation process. So factors such as a family or individual's legal status, forced versus voluntary migration, and perceived discrimination can contribute to family and individuals' anxiety and stress. Also, acculturation stress can lead to substance abuse and dependence. With deportation, it has been found that undocumented Mexican immigrants are more vulnerable to exploitation and are at increased risk to experience traumatic experiences that can include immigration raids and negative experiences with law enforcement, and how all of these can bring about stress for them and for their community as well. So I know in our presentation, we've gone over race and ethnicity and how they are separate, but also how they can contribute to a part of one's culture. So I wanted to dedicate a slide to race-related stress to first raise awareness of its prevalence, but also acknowledge that one's racial experiences can contribute to one's cultural components as well. So race-related stress, it derives from the occurrence of racism and discrimination that individuals, generally African Americans in the US, experience in addition to daily life stress. So race-related stress may involve cultural racism, individual racism, and or institutional racism. And race-related stress can include day-to-day stressors that occur based on the color of one's skin, discrimination, or racism in general. And race-related stress has the ability to affect multiple areas of an individual's life, including physical, emotional, financial, and social aspects of life. So if someone is experiencing race-related stress or has experienced it, they may be feeling some type of anger or helplessness, hopelessness, or anxiety and depression. And race-related stress can be in the form I mentioned before, institutional cultural racism. So institutional race-related stress focuses on perceived stress associated with experiences of racism that surround practices and policies of an institution. So an example of this would be the legal system. And cultural race-related stress, it pinpoints exposure and perceived stress related to individual experiences of racism, usually where damaging a culture's reputation occurs. So listed on this slide are some examples of potential cultural triggers. Some of these I've already mentioned, but it's important to be aware of how something so simple such as sight and smell can trigger or increase an individual's stress. So in addition to sights, sounds, smells, and thoughts, cultural memories are triggers, the immigration experience, exposure to war or political violence, parenting practices, ceremonial practices, religious persecution, extended family displacement, and race-related stress and socioeconomic stressors as well. So cultures can play a role in influencing how people vary in their reactions to stress and how an individual can interpret and assign meaning to trauma. So cultures also influence how people convey traumatic stress through behavior, emotions, and thinking. And culture affects how people convey, cultural affects what qualifies as a legitimate concern and which symptoms warrant help. So, trauma may result from a direct personal experience of an event, witnessing an event, learning about an event, being threatened with death, experiencing a serious injury of self, or experiencing threat to one's physical integrity. And earlier, I mentioned that some cultural stressors can be from environmental and neighborhood stress, acculturative stress, perceived discrimination, microaggressions, and racism. And there are health effects for experiencing these types of stress, such as childhood asthma, substance abuse, and obesity for environmental stress. With socioeconomic, daily, and family stress, it was found in one longitudinal study that with African American women, long-term poverty and family stress were associated with less physical mobility and cognitive functioning at older ages. And African Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Latino Americans have been impacted greatly by hypertension and diabetes due to chronic stress resulting from discrimination. So in terms of types of trauma in a cultural context, the three types are cultural trauma, historical trauma, and intergenerational trauma. So cultural trauma is an attack on the fabric of society, which affects the quality and nature of a community and community members. Historical trauma is the cumulative exposure of traumatic events that affects an individual. And intergenerational trauma occurs when trauma is not resolved, subsequently internalized, and then passed from one generation to the next. And so, an example of cultural trauma would be what happened to Indigenous people by the people of the United States. And an example of intergenerational trauma would be slavery or the Japanese internment camps from World War II. And scientists have also looked at the existence of inherited trauma in groups such as the children of Holocaust survivors, indigenous communities, and the sons of Civil War prisoners of war, to name a few. And findings seem to support the idea that trauma did lead to changes in future generations and their stress levels. So some cautions about cultural trauma that I would like to mention that it is not culturally safe to assume that everyone within a group or community or family has been impacted by historical trauma or by the same experiences as others. And just focusing on cultural or historical trauma can overlook resilience, strength, and persistence of culture in individuals and communities. So culture can affect the choice of coping strategies that an individual can utilize. Cultures may differ in preferred means of emotion-focused coping and then problem-focused coping strategies. So some examples of emotion-focused coping strategies are coloring, gardening, looking at pictures that bring you joy or remind you of people or things or places, reading a book, or smiling. And some examples of problem focused coping strategies are working on managing your time better or establishing healthy boundaries. And culture can provide a source of strength, unique coping skills, and specific resources. And coping can be defined as both a behavioral and a cognitive work that an individual utilizes to minimize the encountered stress. And culture determines views about seeking help, where to go, who to see, and what is helpful, and if there may be a stigma associated with seeking mental health assistance. So in one study examining coping and help seeking for personal, interpersonal, and academic stressors among African American and Latino American college students, both groups were found to be similar in considering family and religion to be highly important coping resources to them. Then in another study of first-year college students' responses to personal problems and their help-seeking attitude, African Americans reported less likely than Asian Americans and white Americans to engage in wishful thinking as a coping strategy. And Asian Americans reported a greater use of avoidant coping as compared to their white American and African American counterparts. So cultural variations on stress and the coping process indicate the existence of an intricate relationship between culture and stress responses. And so these terms, cultural sensitivity, is being aware that cultural differences exist between people without assigning them a value, and these differences have an effect on values, learning, and behavior. Cultural relativism is remembering to not judge another culture based on our own standards of right and wrong. And cultural humility is being respectful and responsive to the beliefs and practices of those from other cultures. And so for this presentation and for the next two slides, we would like to focus on cultural humility. And so we would just like to play this short video on cultural humility and cultural competence.
Cultural competency and cultural humility. You may have heard these terms before, possibly in the context of healthcare settings, and not quite understood what they meant. Let's go over what these terms mean and how they apply to everyday life. To be culturally competent is to learn about other cultures, control your biases, and adapt your behaviors and communication style considering the background of people around you. The goal of cultural competency is effective and informed interaction across various cultures. At face value, cultural competency sounds ideal, but it may actually lead us to rely on generalizations about certain groups rather than recognizing the uniqueness of each individual. We also have to ask ourselves, is it realistic or even possible for people to learn everything about other cultures and become completely bias-free? That's where cultural humility comes in. To be culturally humble is to be aware of social power imbalances, respect other people's values and beliefs, and continuously reflect on your own biases. With cultural humility, there's no expectation that you memorize everything there is to know about other groups. Instead, it's a lifelong process of asking yourself how your own biases might impact the way you treat and understand others, alongside work to minimize that impact. Cultural competency is a goal, while cultural humility is a mindset. Let's go over a few ways to practice cultural humility in our daily lives. Recognize that no culture is superior to another. Become comfortable with reflecting on and acknowledging mistakes you've made. Be honest when you're not sure about something. Learn about other cultures with the awareness that you'll never reach perfect understanding. Ask the people in your life if you can have open discussions and hold each other accountable during your learning journey. The great thing about cultural humility is that it acknowledges that no one can get it right all the time. In fact, a key component of cultural humility is being open about what we haven't learned yet. Although it can feel really uncomfortable to admit when we're wrong or don't know something, that vulnerability leaves room for us to continuously learn, grow, and promote equity and inclusion in our communities.
Okay, so now we're done with the video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Now we're going over cultural humility a little bit more. And this is described as a drive to learn, as well as with respect that honors others. It is a willingness to experience new things, such as practices and ideas. It is also a lifelong process that requires self-reflection. And what I mean by self-reflection is not just learning about another person's culture, but also to examine his or her own beliefs and their own cultural identities to help bring about a better understanding. Next slide, please.
When it comes to trying to reduce stress, it's important to acknowledge that culture can help in stress reduction. As we mentioned earlier, people are different even within cultures. So, to reduce stress in a culturally inclusive way, we have to be open about what connects and culturally grounds us as human beings and our overall sense of being. So, when we think about cultural values, not every person dealing with stress will feel comfortable attending counseling or therapy sessions, meditating or doing yoga, seeking medical advice, or even just talking with other family friends or family members or friends. So, one way to think about culturally inclusive stress reduction is by thinking about your own experiences with stress growing up within your own families and your own communities and cultures, and how stress was dealt with. Reflect on what tools were used, if they were positive or negative tools, and the ways that stress was dealt with. Did those experiences help or harm the situation? And if they were positive, reflect on if you were able to continue doing that in your current life right now, or if you strayed away from them, if they worked, how you're able to kind of utilize them again. So, in addition to identifying for yourself healthy stress reduction, it's also about acknowledging your own racial or cultural biases and having honest conversations about issues, self empathy, self forgiveness, self acceptance, and it's valuing and embracing your own culture and utilizing the unique tools and resources available within your own culture, but also valuing others and their own identity of being, and also giving space for others to practice culturally inclusive stress reduction, and then being compassionate towards yourself and towards others. So I just wanted to bring this up again as we've gone over definitions and talked about cultures and societies, and just again to reflect on what you currently feel our society is in, is whether it be multicultural, cross-cultural, or intercultural, and what kind of society is kind of the goal to practice cultural humility and cultural competence. And I highly recommend reaching out to local community-based organizations and agencies that will be able to supply you with resources and tools to help minimize your stress and help provide healthy coping strategies. So listed on this slide are just a few agencies that are available in our community, although there are many more in our community. So some of them are able to put on workshops. There's a LGBTQA plus resource and community center. So definitely if you're feeling that you might need help getting answers about culturally cope or cultural coping strategies, definitely reach out to our community and community-based agencies. And if you're interested in furthering your knowledge on cultural components on stress, this list will be posted on the chat. You'll be able to click that in the chat. So we have articles, a TED Talk, the agencies that I talked about in the previous slide, their links will be at the bottom as well. So if you're interested, go ahead and feel free to click any of those links. And if you're interested in gaining more knowledge, talking about cultural components on stress and stress reduction, have any questions, comments, or concerns, our information, our coordinators, and us as MSW interns, we're available through phone or email, or reaching out to the Social Sciences Division. So our contact information will be listed on the chat as well. And lastly, feel free to type in your questions. We have time for a Q&A. So if you have any questions, definitely type them in the Q&A section or direct any comments in the chat. Okay, so if we don't have any questions, comments, or concerns, we want to thank you for joining us today for today's webinar, and we hope you have a good rest of your day.
Yeah, thank you guys very much.
And I would like to thank both Natalie and Enrique for all of their work on this project. And I would like to thank everyone who's been involved in the Campus Stress Reduction Project's work this semester. Just so you know, all of the stress reduction sessions have been recorded, and they actually are being hosted for us on the professional development website here at FCC. The link is in the chat if you'd like to go back and either reference this session or other sessions in this series, you may do so there. And that link is an open link to anybody that you'd like to share this information with. These sessions are designed for a broad audience, so anyone who might help or be benefited by these can absolutely access those links there. And in addition, as was already mentioned, the MSW Interns is an ongoing project in the Social Sciences Division in collaboration between our Human Services Department and California State University Fresno's Masters of Social Work program. So if you ever have a student or someone who needs assistance with these program areas, please do feel free to contact either myself or Renee Clift or Natasha Bibioff, who are the two human services instructors of that program who helped coordinate the interns' work. And finally, in addition to Professors Renee and Clift and Bibioff, our own Director of Psychological Services, Mr. Samuel Montano, helped to develop this full series, which has been a part of our ongoing work to try and assist our colleagues during a fairly stressful time for all of us during the pandemic. We certainly hope that this series has been helpful to you. And if you have any suggestions or comments, please do feel free to share them with any of us. We look forward to working with you as we continue to transition back into a face-to-face and somewhat online campus in future. And we know that there will be more challenges along the way, but we know that working together, we will all be able to accomplish what we need to for our students and for each other. Have a wonderful day, everybody.